this is William Bell. Welcome back to our study on was the second coming of Christ in AD 70, where we are addressing some arguments by Ben F. Vick Jr., who wrote an article saying that there was a division in Matthew 24 between verses 31 through 34, and then the division starting in verse 36 to refer to a future coming, an alleged future coming, future to us today, as opposed to verses 1 through 34 being a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. And so what he sees is two sections in the chapter, one happening in the first century and one that has not yet occurred that is supposed to happen at some time in the future. And we are addressing that in these series of studies that we want to share with you. In this video, another study where we're going to talk about dividing Matthew based on the word but, where we're going to be looking particularly at the heaven and earth that is found in the two sections. In the previous video, we talked about the Great Tribulation and showed how the Great Tribulation and resurrection were connected. So if you haven't watched the first series of videos 1 through 4, we encourage you to watch those. And while each video is separate within itself, if you take them all together, you will see how we are building this response. And we're, particularly responding to very specific arguments and reasoning that was presented in the paper. Now, again, this is not an attack on the individual. This is simply a reference to the particular arguments that were made, and we want to make that very clear. We have no ill will toward the individual whatsoever. This is simply about what the text says and our attempt to understand the text based on the arguments that are presented. So let's talk about dividing Matthew based upon the word but. And so another challenge to this division of Matthew 24 in trying to see verses 1 through 34 happening in 70 AD and then verses 36 and following to happen in the future is the problem or the challenge of leaving the heaven and earth, which is found in verse 35, in a limbo state. This is what really has amazed me with people who seek to divide Matthew 24. They will say verses 1 through 34 refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. And the reason they do that is because it says, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. And so they say, well, all these things refer to all the events in verse 1 down through 34. And then they will say, but of that day and hour, and they will then take that statement and say the word but is a division in the chapter, separating the events of 1 through 34 from verses 36 and following. So but, therefore, becomes as one person has said, the continental dividing line in the chapter. Well, I want to address that particularly because it leaves verse 35 in a limbo state. And that's very problematic for this view that wants to divide the chapter in verse 36. So let's consider that and talk about it. Now, here's what we have in Matthew 24. In verse 29, we have a decreation. We have what we call decreation language, the dissolving of the sun, moon, and the stars, which would be an end of a heaven and earth, found in verses 1 through 34. So let's take a look at that. In Matthew 24, beginning at verse 29, and we talked about the tribulation in the previous verse, but what we have in addition to the tribulation is the end of the world, because the scripture says in verse 29, immediately, notice that time frame, immediately after what? The Great Tribulation. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. So what we have here is the destruction of heaven and earth. We have a falling of the sun, moon, and the stars. The sun darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars fall from heaven. That's decreation language. It's prophetic language. It's metaphorical language. It has to be. If it's found in verse 30, in the section between verses 1 through 34, it's just a symbolical and metaphorical description of the destruction of Jerusalem in the language of the prophets. And if you're not familiar with that language, that's precisely what it is. It is prophetic language. It's apocalyptic language. It's used several times in the Old Testament. Most people who are familiar with Old Testament prophetic literature understand that. If not, I have a video on 2 Peter 3. You can look it up on my channel, and I will go into more detail in that particular video. And I've also got videos on the end of the world. You can check those out as well that go into much more detail. And I'm not going to do that here because that's not the study that I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the fact that we have this end of heaven and earth here, and then we have a heaven and earth passing in verse 35 that seems to be in a limbo state that people just don't consider. Now, I had a debate with a gentleman back in 1994, I believe it was, and he did, of course, include verse 35 with verse 34. In other words, his division was Matthew 24, verses 1 through 35. Stephen Wiggins, by the way, was the person I debated. Now, here's the interesting point. They all divide it in different places. One divides it in verse 34. Another, like Stephen Wiggins, divided it in verse 35. And then here is Ben Vick Jr., who divides it, along with many others like him, in verse 36. They can't figure out where to exactly divide the chapter. We say that is a colossal problem. That's one of the tremendous difficulties with attempting to divide the chapter. Nobody knows exactly where it's divided. They all want to say, no, it's divided here, it's divided here, it's divided there. They can't figure it out. We're wanting to say to you, it's not divided. And we're going to try to demonstrate that by talking about the heaven and earth. Now, if, as Ben Vick has to admit, sun turns to darkness, moon turns to blood, the stars fall from heaven, well, that's an end of heaven and earth in verse 29. So he's got one heaven and earth passing away in 70 AD. But then if verse 35 does not belong to that section, then he has two heavens and earth passing away in 70 AD, or the heaven and earth in verse 35 is the same heaven and earth of verse 29. And that's exactly what the case is. So when Jesus says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not pass away, the heaven and earth of verse 35 has to be the same heaven and earth of Matthew 24:29, or we have two heavens and earth. And if we have two, either both of them pass away in 70 AD, or one of them passes in 70, and the other one must pass away at some alleged time in the future, which I think is Ben Vick's position, even though he doesn't state it. Well, here's the problem with that. If verse 35 belongs to the alleged future return of Christ, then how can verse 36 be a division of the chapter? Wouldn't that mean that verse 35 is the division of the chapter and not verse 36? But if verse 35 is the division of the chapter, then that means that the word but does not divide the chapter. And that destroys the entire approach of Ben Vick's argumentation. That destroys the whole piece that he's written as a refutation, because it's all focused on but being the dividing line. Let me repeat that. He either must place verse 35, the end of heaven and earth, with verse 29, which is the section that he says is 70 AD, and they must be the same. But if not, they are two different heaven and earths that both pass away at the same time. Well, that's a problem. But if verse 35 belongs to the alleged future return of Christ, then verse 36 is not the division of the chapter, because you could not divide verse 35 from verse 36, because both of them would be an alleged future coming. But that would mean the word but is not a division, because the word but would not be dividing verse 35 from verse 36. Sometimes it makes you wonder how deeply people really investigate the scriptures and how quickly they are to assail a person's position that they don't study. You see, if we're going to be honest and trustworthy with the Word of God, then we need to really consider these things. But what implication does that have for not knowing the day and the hour? Because if verse 36 doesn't divide the chapter, if the word but is not the continental dividing line, there is no continental dividing line between verse 34 and 35. And that would prove that not knowing the day and the hour refers to 70 AD. That's pretty simple from my point of view. And so, the other point we'd like to make on this: there are about 12 occurrences of the word but, if you go back and look at the original language, in the second section of Matthew 24, down to the end of the chapter, in verse 51. So if the word but divides the coming in verse 36 from the destruction of Jerusalem, the coming of the Lord at the destruction of Jerusalem, then we would have about a dozen alleged future comings based on just the word but, because it's not the only occurrence after verse 36. So if you want to divide the word but, let's start adding them up and see how many comings we do have after verse 36, including that verse. That's the problem we get to, or we have, when we start trying to use an arbitrary argument like dividing it based upon the word but in Matthew 24. As the old saying goes, that which proves too much proves nothing. It would prove that we have almost a dozen or maybe a dozen or more comings of Christ by the division of the word but. And that just isn't going to wash in this study. In the next section, I'm going to talk about an argument from John MacArthur. And the reason I introduced this argument is because it's also an argument on the word but. Brother Vic didn't mention this argument, but since we're in that territory, we're going to mention it. But I think it deserves a video all to itself. And so rather than make this one longer, we're going to do that in video number 6. You know the drill. Subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment, pro or con. We try to read them all, and we certainly try to respond. And, if you got any animosity, please save it, because we'll delete it. In other words, if you want to say something very harsh and evil and something that's unchristian is what we mean. We don't even care that much about you being mean as long as you're decent in what you do. The other is visit us on our website at www.allthingsfulfill.com. I hope you're enjoying these videos and that you're really getting some good points from them. I look forward to being with you in the next one. Thank you.